Hi parents, Jason Porterfield here. Hopefully last week you saw my email about Creative World Justice. It's our new gathering that we're going to have for junior high and senior high students, and it's open to you as parents. I really want to encourage you to come as well. It's going to be on Wednesdays, starting Wednesday, February 1st. It will always be 6:30 to 7:30 p.m. and it will run February through March, so about 9 Wednesdays. Last week I told you a little bit about it. Creative World Justice is a weekly gathering that seeks to ensure that we, as Christ followers, are working for the transformation of unjust situations around the world. Now, if you read that email last week, you may have been thinking, come on, Jason, really, what can a small group of youth actually do to work for transformation of unjust situations? And so today, I want to share with you a few stories from my time in Vancouver. Creative World Justice is a weekly gathering that our missional community started in Vancouver when I was there, working amongst the poor. And our homeless neighbors would come, and Christians from churches out in the suburbs would come. We'd share a potluck meal together, and then we would work for the transformation of unjust situations. Don't forget there are 3 strands, right? Some weeks we will study and learn about God's heart for justice and how we as Christ followers can work for justice in Christ-like ways. Other weeks we will research a specific injustice that we are passionate about. I don't know what that issue will be for us as a youth group in February and March. We will decide as a group. So we'll learn about a specific injustice that burdens us or that we're connected to in some way, and we'll research it a lot and learn as much as we can about it. And then the third strand is that we as a group will creatively come up with ideas for how we could actually work for the transformation of that situation. And then we will implement those ideas. So it's tempting to think you could not do much, but I submit for your consideration that God is always looking for just even a small group of Christ followers who are willing to be his hands and feet and creatively come up with ideas for how to work for justice. So I want to share with you a few stories from our time in Vancouver, about 2.5 years of every week meeting for this Creative World Justice. One of the first issues we looked at was the treatment of foreign domestic workers in Singapore. So these are Indonesians and Filipinos and Sri Lankans who come to Singapore. Now, 1 out of every 6 families in Singapore employs a foreign domestic worker, or what we would call a housemaid from another country, right? Well, in Singaporean law, foreign domestic workers are the only people not considered employees, and thus they do not receive any workers' rights. Therefore, in Singapore, and again, this came about through lots of research, we learned that the average foreign domestic worker gets 1 day off every 6 months. Many of them are practically enslaved because their visas are kept from them until they can pay off the debt of getting that visa. So when we learned this, we researched the topic for a long time, and then we came up with an idea. And we got about 30 people to dress up as enslaved housemaids. You can see some of the pictures in the email. And we went down to the Singaporean consulate, and we had found the exact clause in the workers' rights laws that could be changed that would actually give rights to these foreign domestic workers. And we asked the consulate to encourage the government to change the laws. Now, we had learned about Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur and other cities that were similar to Singapore who gave their foreign domestic workers a day off each week. We had looked into statistics about the suicide rate amongst foreign domestic workers in Singapore versus Hong Kong. Huge difference. And so, of course, having so many people dressed up as enslaved housemaids caused all the TV cameras to come out from the city, and we made the news and front page newspaper articles about it, so the word got out. Well, the next thing we did was we wrote a letter to the 10 largest churches in Singapore, asking them to model a different way as a congregation by giving their foreign domestic workers a day off each week. And we referred to the 10 Commandments about this, because you remember the commandment about Sabbath, right? Well, it says, you shall not work, you, your sons and daughters, and your maidservants and menservants. Give them a day off. It's one of the 10 Commandments. So we said, this is a no-brainer. But we also encourage those churches to work for the transformation of that law in Singapore. And by God's grace, about a year after we started working on this issue, Singapore changed its law. And foreign domestic workers now get a day off each week. I don't know how much our part had to do with getting that law changed, but we were glad and happy to see the law changed. Well, soon after that issue, an Indonesian friend of mine living in Vancouver named Adi, he came to us and he said, "You know what? I used to work on a cruise ship, and it was just like the treatment of foreign domestic workers in Singapore. Most of the Indonesians and Filipinos working on cruise ships, they work below deck and were not allowed to be seen by the guests. So these aren't the employees you see as a guest when you go on one of your cruises, right?" And he said there's something called flags of convenience. See, because cruise ships sail in international waters, they can actually register their ship in any country they want to. So it doesn't matter if they're servicing all American tourists, right? They can register anywhere. And so the vast majority of cruise ship companies have registered in a handful of countries that have like the worst workers' rights laws. So they attract these Indonesians and Filipinos and others from developing countries to work on their ships with these promises of seeing the world, but you have to fork over a couple $1,000s to get the visa to work on the ship, and then the ship holds your visa until you have been able to pay it off. And so many of these workers work every day without a day off for over a year before they even can pay off the debt to leave the job. So when we learned about this, it broke our heart. So we decided to create a pirate flash mob, and we called ourselves the Pirates of Justice. And of course, everyone wanted to dress up like a pirate. And so we had a few hundred people convene in front of some cruise ships. And of course, because there were hundreds of people dressed as pirates, once again, the TV news cameras came. We made front page news, and we were able to get the word out about the conditions of cruise ships and the flags of convenience. And we were able to call for Canada to require cruise ship companies that dock in Canada to follow and obey Canadian workers' laws. Well, after that, a Canadian who worked on one of those cruise ships that docked in Vancouver came to us. She had seen the newspaper article about our Pirate Act, and her heart was broken for the treatment she saw of her fellow employees on the cruise ships, those who weren't allowed to be seen by guests, those below the decks. And she said, "You know what? It's practically a sweatship." And so she said, "What can I do?" Well, we creatively came up with an idea over a few weeks, and we decided to smuggle about 100 disposable cameras through that Canadian employee, onto the ship, and she gave them to the Filipinos and the Indonesians and the others working below deck and said, "Take pictures of what your living and work condition is like, and write down stories of what it's like to work on a cruise ship." Well, then we got those cameras back, and some of the artists in our group developed the cameras and picked out the best pictures, and we matched up the stories and the accounts, and then we rented a space on a corner and made it into an art exhibit so that people could look through the big window walls there and see in, and people were able to come in for a couple weeks and learn about the plight of those working on cruise ships. And we also were able to give them information about how they can work to bring about just change on those cruise ships. One last story. When I lived there, it was 2007 till the start of 2010, and as you likely remember, the Winter Olympics came in 2010. So when Vancouver applied to host the Winter Olympics, the Olympic Committee wanted to see two things in their bid. One of the things was, what are you going to do to provide housing for the poor? And that's because the Olympic Committee knows that housing prices go up when the Olympics come in a city, and thus the homeless population increases significantly. So they always look in city applicants, what are you going to do for the poor? The Olympic Committee also wants to know, what are you going to do to address sex trafficking? Just like the Super Bowl coming to Houston, right? When visitors come to a city, sex trafficking increases significantly. Well, Vancouver said, we will build 3,200 homes for the homeless. But as the Olympics neared, Vancouver had built 0 homes. In fact, they used the money they said they were going to use to build homes for the homeless, and they used it to build homes for fish. They built a $76 million aquarium. So a baker in our group said, why don't we bake 3,200 gingerbread homes and we will deliver them to City Hall? So that's what we did. We made that many gingerbread homes, we took them to City Hall, and we urged City Hall to keep their promise to provide housing for the poor. Well, the other issue was sex trafficking. And we had come up with multiple ideas. People went with video cameras or their smartphones outside some of the main brothels during the Olympics to videotape any mistreatment of women. But we also had a campaign that we started called Buying Sex is Not a Sport. And our original idea was we made these giant stencils about 4 by 6 feet that had the phrase "buying sex is not a sport," and we were going to put them on the sidewalk in front of some of the main brothels in the city and strip joints, and we were going to color that saying in to remind people that sex trafficking is not okay. Well, when the Olympics came, our group went and we went to color in that very first stencil of "buying sex is not a sport," and the police stopped us and they said, and they were just doing their job, right? But they said, "You cannot do that. That is defacing public property. You cannot sidewalk chalk that message in." So we went back crushed, heartbroken, until someone in our group had another creative idea. And we rented a power washer and we power washed over that stencil the message "buying sex is not a sport" on the sidewalks in front of these brothels and strip joints. Why? Because cleaning the sidewalk is never illegal. So those are just a handful of ways, whether it was foreign domestic workers in Singapore, or working to see fair treatment of employees on cruise ships, protection for women during the Olympics, and housing for the poor. These were a few of the initiatives that a small group of people were able to come up with by God's grace, the Spirit's guidance, as we prayerfully and creatively worked for justice. I'm excited to see what God's going to do through our youth, and you hopefully as well if you're able to join us during the months of February and March as we set aside time each week to seek to work for the transformation of unjust situations around the world. Would you be praying for that time? And if you're able, I would love for you to commit to coming on those Wednesdays. Again, 6:30 to 7:30 on Wednesdays starting February 1st. David Bridges and I are going to facilitate those times. Thank you so much for listening.